down to less than 4 billion people by 2050. But bear in mind that because more than 50% of human beings live in cities now, and that's where all of our technology is centered, if we lose 50% of humanity abruptly in the next 30 years, we're going to lose substantial amounts of our technological infrastructure. So they anticipate that by 2050, living conditions on this planet will resemble the beginning of the 20th century. This is not good. I mean, this is really not good. And I don't know about you, but I have children and stepchildren and grandchildren, and all of them. Like I have three wonderful Hungarian stepsons. And if I drop them in the middle of Beijing tomorrow with their cell phones, they could survive just fine. But if I take them out into the forest in the northern part of Hungary without their cell phones and say survive, they're dead. Because one of the things we've done by making ourselves urbanized, an urbanized species, is that we have created at least two generations of people now who find it almost impossible to live outside of a highly technological niche. When Hurricane Katrina ruined the city of New Orleans 10 years ago, within 72 hours of losing electricity and transport into the city, people were killing each other for food. And these are some realities that we have to face, and we can change that. With respect to emerging diseases, we have to be proactive. We have to stop waiting until the next big outbreak happens and then heroically respond to it. Because, let's face it, my doctor is right. If I lose weight and do not have a heart attack, that's going to be better for me, and it's going to be cheaper for the healthcare system than if I stay fat, I have a heart attack, and they have to save me with coronary bypass surgery. And then I have to change my diet anyway. So I might as well do it now, right? And save some money. Most of the money, that $1 trillion a year that's being spent on emerging diseases, is not spent on huge global pandemics, like the ones that Bill Gates is warning about now. All of those are what we call death by 1,000 cuts. A little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there. That completely preoccupies all of the existing resources of agriculture and public health systems worldwide, which means that when a big pandemic happens, there aren't any resources left to deal with them. And we're not planning for this. We're not anticipating it. The world's public health and veterinary and agricultural health people act like the next report of an emerging disease is the last one that will ever happen. And it's partly because they've been trained in a paradigm of coevolution that is manifestly not true. What we need to do now, and it's with emerging diseases, you could put in food, water, warming, sea level rises, any of the threat multipliers for climate change in there. What we need now is policies that anticipate the future. We have to anticipate that things are going to get worse for us. We have to accept that, and then we have to adapt to what's coming. We can no longer afford to pretend that either nothing's happening or once it happens, we can fix it. Because the only way we can fix what's coming at us is to adapt to it. We will not magically come up with the right adaptation. When the Greenland ice sheet falls into the Atlantic Ocean, New York City will have 3 hours to evacuate. They are not going to magically come up with a solution at that point to save themselves. They will die. We are already moving into a world where there are two kinds of places for human beings. The places that people are running away from and places that people are running to. And both of those situations have severe consequences for our future as a technological species. We need to try to buy time. We need to try to adapt to what's coming and to accept what's coming. With respect to emerging diseases, we need to do what we call finding them before they find us. We need to know what's coming. If there's malaria in southern Switzerland, there is nothing to keep that malaria from coming through on a straight line through southern Austria, right to Lake Balaton in Hungary within 3 years. So, what do you do about it? What do you do? Well, it turns out that the answer is both simple and really complicated, because we have a protocol. We know what to do. We know how to get people out there, citizen scientists working with highly technologically people, and all this good technology and stuff. We know how to get out there and find this stuff and track it as it's coming towards us. We know how to teach people how to mitigate the possibility of getting malaria by doing things like looking for mosquito larvae in the bird bath in your garden and dumping them out. We know how to do that. There are a lot of things we can do. The problem is, this requires a degree of cooperation among human beings that humanity has never done before. I mean, in particular, doing something to protect your country from emerging diseases requires that you help the countries that are the sources of those diseases coming at you, even if you don't like them. So, for example, Hungarians sort of don't like anybody, but they mostly don't like people coming from parts of the world that used to occupy them. What a surprise, right? You used to occupy our country, we don't like you anymore. Well, this is not unreasonable, right? But it also is something that we cannot afford as a species. This is going to be very difficult. And I would say that most scientists would never say this in public, but when they're talking among scientists, they will say, we don't think that's going to happen. And this is what we call the Cassandra Collective. Okay, so the myth of Cassandra. Cassandra was the sister of Paris who stole Helen of Troy and started the whole thing up. Well, when Cassandra was a priestess of Athena, Apollo tried to seduce her and she wouldn't let him. And so he cursed her. He said, I'm going to curse you. I'm going to give you the curse of true prophecy. Everything you say will be true, but no one will ever believe it. And so she was the one who said, I really don't think you should bring that wooden horse inside the city. And clearly that's a motif. Okay, the reason there's a mythical figure like that is because 3,000 years ago, human beings recognized that there were always people in their society who saw what was going to happen and warned about it, but it seemed so strange that nobody would listen to them. And so when we say, it's easy for a scientist to say, okay, time for all the countries on the world to cooperate and not be enemies anymore. I mean, that's a typical scientific statement, right? Now, in the real world of social science, all of our social science colleagues just go, what is wrong with you scientists? This is not going to happen. We have, give us something we can work with. But we are rapidly approaching a point where if we don't do something, something's going to happen anyway. And the biggest issue, we have a focus group on sustainability in Kursig at the Institute for Advanced Study in Kursig. And there is an emerging sense that the most important element of sustainability now has nothing to do with growth or development. It has to do with survival. And 10, 15 years ago, nobody doing sustainability work was thinking about sustainability in terms of basic human survival. Now that's what we have to think about. We have to start with, what do we need in order to survive? Well, the reality is, in a highly technological, highly interconnected, highly globalized world economy, individual places, no individual place on this planet is self-sufficient. So we either cooperate globally, or we find networks of cooperators. We find networks of people that we can cooperate with. But countries that decide that it will not happen to them, as far as we're concerned, are dead. And sadly, that includes my country. Right now, NASA estimates that the drought that is beginning in North America will last until 2050. So that date keeps coming up, right? And by 2050, the United States will have lost between 35 and 65% of its food production. If it loses 35% of its food production, it ceases to exist as a global economic entity, because that's what the United States economic, all of its trade is based on food surplus. Plus, all the countries that rely on American food surpluses will be faced with severe food shortages. If it's more than 35%, the United States will be in a position where it will need to beg food from all the many friends it's been making for the last 30 or 40 years on this planet. This is not a good situation. The American national strategy for dealing with emerging diseases is, and I kid you not, it is, it will never happen here. That's their plan. That's why they're denying that there's Zika in North America, even though there's Zika babies in 44 states out of 50. That's why they're denying, they're saying that Zika is a mosquito-transmitted disease, when it is primarily a sexually transmitted disease that can also be transmitted by mosquitoes during the summertime. They're in denial, and it's going to kill them as a culture. They're in denial about disease, they're in denial about food production, they're in denial about sea level rises. The storm that devastated Houston, Texas last summer, that was a 7-meter sea level storm surge. That's equivalent to a 7-meter sea level rise, except it would be global and forever. 120,000 years ago, this planet had the same amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as it has now, and it was the same temperature as it is now. And sea levels were 7 meters higher than they are now. The specialists who work on sea level rise problems are really worried because they don't know why the big one hasn't happened yet. They don't know what the planet's waiting for. And the longer this goes, the warmer things get, the greater, without some big release, the greater the possibility that it's going to be a catastrophic change when it happens. And if this, if this is all happening at more or less the same time in the next 30 years, this is, we really are not prepared to survive, which is terrible because we have all the ability to survive if we want to. I mean, all that technology in these cities that could be at risk is exactly the source of policies and programs that could enable us to survive. So mostly what I'm doing these days is just trying to beg humanity to save itself. Because, like I said, I have a daughter, I have some Hungarian stepsons, I got some American grandchildren, and I actually care about them. And in some strange abstract way, I would feel really bad if I lived long enough to see that before I died, things were going to be really bad for them. I would feel somehow responsible for that as a scientist. So evolutionary biology is really, really important, but nowadays there is no kind of basic biology, no kind of basic science that can be done without thinking about the consequences of global climate change and what we need to do about it. So I know I've dragged on long and I've made you, like I said, I was going to ruin your day, but hopefully for some of you, I will have helped, especially for graduate students. I've helped give you some ideas for how you might change your life and things that you might do to try to ensure your future. Thank you. So now everybody needs a drink. Or you're just, or, you know, either a drink of vodka or a drink of hemlock.
Бачите, думки літають в аудиторії, як і інститутом, прямо як вірус. І у нас питання впливу змін клімату на нашу країну і на світ піднімалося вже років 10 тому Леонідом Івановичем Францевичем. І дуже жаль, що його тут немає, тут було про що побалакати. Але, будь ласка, ваші питання. Anything clear?
But, I mean, and this is exactly right. Suppose we have, imagine a conservation biology project in which you want to reintroduce a species that has gone extinct in part of its range, and you're going to reintroduce it. How many programs for such reintroductions incorporate the likelihood that the reintroduction is going to increase the chances of disease? Nobody, okay? Now one of our good friends in Budapest, Gábor Foodbody, he works with ticks and tick-borne diseases, acarologist at the vet school. And Gábor, in Budapest, there's a big island in the middle of the Danube called Margaret Island. And it's a recreational area, there's sports clubs there, there are rock concerts there, there are tourism's major tourism site, major recreational area for people. Gábor began looking at the ticks on the hedgehogs on Margaret Island. And he discovered that the abundance of ticks on hedgehogs on Margaret Island is 10 times higher than in the forests. And not only that, but all of those ticks are loaded with rickettsial pathogens. But there hadn't been any major disease outbreak on Margaret Island, even though there was this, the people were wandering in a soup of disease. Why not? Well, it turns out that most of the island, most of the public places, the grass is cut short. And so the ticks don't have tall enough grass to climb up on and wave for hosts. The only place they can do that is in the forested areas, the areas where there are trees, where they don't cut the grass, okay? So if you don't go into that part of the park, you're never going to come into contact with a tick that could give you Rocky Mountain spotted fever or one of these other tick-borne diseases. But the government of Hungary had only 2 public toilets on Margaret Island because they were worried about people having sex in public toilets, especially gay sex. They were so worried about that, there were only 2 public toilets on the entire island, and they were only open from 9 in the morning until 5 at night. And Gábor said, look, the reality is that gay sex in public bathrooms is a lot less of a problem than ruining your entire tourism industry because Budapest becomes known as a place where you can go into the park and die. So now there are public toilets all over the island. And it turns out, I mean, the government paid attention and understood that the immediate cost of putting extra public toilets out there was tiny compared to the cost of a major outbreak that could, you know, people getting sick during a rock concert, boom, nobody ever comes back. And that's a major part of their, I mean, tourism is a major part of Budapest's economy. That's a major part of Budapest's tourism industry. And so the government understood that this was something that would cost them a small amount of money now to make sure that they would never have to pay a huge price later. And it's the best example we know of this kind of thing. But the problem is that if that's true for ticks on hedgehogs on Margaret Island, it's true for every city on the planet that's trying to increase the green space in the city. I was in Brazil at the end of February, and I gave this talk, and 3 people came up to me just like this, and they said, we've been hired by Brazilian cities to design, to make them greener. And you're telling us this? I said, yep. And they said, well, that probably explains why Sao Paulo, which is a city of 20 million people, just closed all of its city parks because of yellow fever and malaria transmission. They closed all of their city parks. So there's nothing we can do that doesn't have some, there's nothing we can do to try to make things better that doesn't also have potential costs. And this is another, another really important evolutionary principle. Everything that happens in evolution has costs as well as benefits. And if we only think about the benefits, that's what's happened with biological control. Nobody ever anticipated that the biological control agent could be released in a new place and find a local host that it liked better than the target host. And it keeps happening over and over and over and over again. And we keep thinking, next time it'll be okay. Next time we have it figured out. But there's all this potential and green spaces in large cities for all of the benefits that they're going to provide, the ecosystem services, right? One of the ecosystem services is an increase in zoonotic disease potential. So actually what we should be doing is we should have no green spaces inside central cities. We should have free mass transportation out to the periphery, and all of our green spaces should be out there. And we should make mass transit free to people to encourage them to go out and relax in a green space. But the more green spaces we intersperse in our cities, the more we're increasing the chances of zoonotic disease outbreak. And that's going to offset the extra oxygen the trees are producing.
More questions? Yeah.
May I ask, very impressive talk, but are there any recipes what country, what government have to do? Because everything looks very scary. What we have to do? First step, second step, third step. Are there any programs elaborated how to mitigate all situations? Maybe it's softer, maybe it's not so.
Well, it's a two-part answer.
Yeah.
Okay. The first part of the answer is that there's a very well articulated protocol, what we call the DAMA protocol. But the bad news is that it's not being implemented anywhere. And we're in this funny, what we call a catch-22 situation. So for example, Gabor and I and some other people were in Munich in April. We are going to try to apply, there's an EU program called a COST program, which is a grant. Basically, that's money that the EU would give EU people to build a network of researchers to then get the big money to do a program. So we were going to do this, get the money to bring together a network of researchers. And they do it this way because the initial money can only go to EU members, okay, all the people in the grant. But once the EU gives them the money, they can bring in people from anywhere in the world to be part of their network of specialists. Then you have a global network of specialists who will increase your chances of success with other grant proposals. And we wanted to do this with DAMA. And one of the people who was there is a guy from Norway who's part of the One Health network. You know, he's very highly placed in the One Health thing. And he said, look, this is wonderful, and this is exactly what we need to do, but I'm telling you right now that nobody who's going to review these proposals knows what the DAMA protocol is. And the reason nobody knows what the DAMA protocol is because the book that we wrote that was supposed to be published by now is not published. And the reason for that is because we submitted the manuscript last June, almost 1 year ago. A month later, the science editor at the University of Chicago Press left to become the director of the Princeton University Press. The University of Chicago Press took 10 months to hire a new science editor. And during that time, none of their science projects could be approved to go forward. So we were getting reviews saying, you've got to publish this now, you've got to publish this now, this is really important stuff, you know. So now it will come out sometime in 2019, and so the guy from Norway who was at this meeting in Munich said, there is no point in applying for this grant this year, it will not get funded because nobody knows what you're talking about. If the book is published next year and is out for 2 or 3 months before the deadline for the grant, then you can submit it next year, and then the reviewers will have some idea of what you're talking about. So this is a situation, we even talk about this in the book, about how bureaucracy is killing us. I mean, the problem with bureaucracies are wonderful as long as nothing changes. I mean, how many of you have gone to, some simple part of bureaucracy like the post office or any kind of government bureaucracy, and you start to say, I've got a little bit of a problem. Instantly, body language is like, So if you go in and say, here's the protocol, I followed the protocol, here it is, oh, that's great, here's the receipt, Bureaucracies are designed to be very rigid. That's the essence of their efficiency. So bureaucracies, and we are a bureaucratized species now. Bureaucracies are terrible at responding to changes. And that's this particular situation. The managing editor at the University of Chicago he does not understand why we're upset, because in his mind, they've done a really good job. We're a really important press, so we should take a long time to make sure we get exactly the right person. And we're going, if things are going to go terribly wrong within 30 years, you have just cost us 3% of the time that we have left. You know, doing your due diligence and making sure you got exactly the right person. And that's because if you're at the University of Chicago Press, all this climate change stuff is very abstract to you. Your life is fine. I mean, in fact, the winters are a little bit warmer in Chicago, so everything's good. You're not seeing any shortages in the grocery stores. So you know, that's it. So yeah, we know exactly, this is the frustration. We know exactly what to do. And as soon as somebody decides, it's like we built a Ferrari, but we have no gasoline, right? As soon as somebody starts to pour gasoline into the tank, we had a workshop at Lake Bulaton last October, and there was really broad agreement that this would work. This is how we do it. And it's a combination of working with local people in local villages and networking with specialists, science specialists, and policy people Yeah. And I'll talk about this in Ascandia. My talk in Ascandia will be about that protocol. Because that's where you have to talk about it, is out in the local people.
Russia. More questions? No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds a little bit like we're just expecting the last season of Game of Thrones. That's how your lecture sounds. We really are expecting what will be in the Zoom, and early or later, everybody will die. Is it correct?
Okay. Here's what I want. Okay. I want us to react to possibilities the same way your military does. The same way the United States military is the organization in the United States that spends more money on climate change data from the National Research Council than any other organization in America. And I guarantee you that every organized military in every country on this planet has contingency plans for, not just for climate change in particular, or in general, but pandemics, sea level rise, big storms, and all these sorts of things. And nobody thinks that it is a waste of money for military people to anticipate problems so that they never happen. Okay, one of the reasons countries like China and the United States and Russia spend so much money trying to anticipate potential conflicts between them is based on the assumption that all those countries are all doing the same thing and that they're all going to come to the same conclusion that this would not be good for anybody, so then it doesn't happen. So nobody thinks that it's a waste of money to plan for wars that we never have to fight. But imagine what the reaction would be if some military leader said, oh, we never saw that coming. We never saw that as a possibility. I mean, that person would be dead in 20 minutes. So, you know, the military people are extremely pragmatic. And it is the US military is the only organization of the United States government right now that actually takes climate change seriously. And this is a good thing and a bad thing, because in the American system of government, if there is a major pandemic, even if the military has a plan, they cannot simply implement the plan because there's strong civilian control of the military. And so right now, if there was a major pandemic in the United States, the Pentagon would have to ask Donald Trump for permission to do something about it. So what do? Well, there's an election in November. You know, the American people can decide to not vote stupid this time. I mean, it's a very strange thing, because a lot of this is all about personal responsibility. You know, in the United States, 45% of the reason we have Donald Trump is because 45% of American voters did not vote because they have no confidence in the system at all anymore. I mean, that's a terrible thing. 45% of Americans have no confidence in the American form of government because they looked at the two candidates and said, they're both losers. Yeah, one of them's psychotic, but they're both losers. Neither one of them is particularly good. So, well, you know, if you vote stupid, you get stupid. So that's, you know, that's one of the things I keep doing, like with my family, for example, who think Donald Trump was the best thing that ever happened because, you know, at least he's not black. I keep telling them that, you know, Trump is a symptom of something. Trump's not a cause of any of this. Trump's a symptom of something else, because the United States is not the only participatory democracy where voting has decreased significantly over the last 30 years. The only countries where voting has not decreased are countries where voting is mandatory by law, where you have to pay a fine if you don't vote. But every country that has voluntary voting, every democratic representative democracy that has voluntary voting over the last 30 years, including Canada, has seen this happen. People are beginning to worry that democratic governments are not capable of responding rapidly enough and effectively enough to things like climate change. On the other hand, they don't know what the alternative would be. So, I'm not saying we're all dead, but I'm saying that if we don't start doing something right now, we will be. And the only good news in this is that we actually, the scientific community as a whole, actually has a pretty good idea of what we could do. But there's no place on this planet where scientists can enact social programs by themselves. So every scientist on this planet needs policymaker, politician, somebody, government official, to implement the plan.
I have a question after just such a long discussion, by the way. Thank you very much for your so pathetic presentation about our future, which probably ruined our day. Nevertheless, what I wanted to stress, actually, your presentation were more philosophical, I guess so, and analytical. Would I suggest that your book has much more scientific data and facts? Because everything should be based on facts. Maybe hundreds of facts are proving just climate changes and proving also appearance of new epidemics globally. So because thinking globally, we need to think locally. At least thinking about our nature in a city, would we say that new possible diseases come into every city, possibility of that have been proved on some cases, like in Zika virus or other viruses, which change their hosts. For example, this paper, this paper, this paper. Maybe these papers have been mentioned in your book as well. Are any or many facts about such changes of specialization for parasites and for pathogens as well? How many of them? Just few or dozens or hundreds?
Well, we were restricted in our book. The editors told us to restrict our bibliography to less than 1,500 references out of about 12,000 that we have. The reality is we in fact don't know of any publications that have not found this pattern.
Well,
I have a question that leads to the previous one. We have the primates and humans in most cases cohabitate. Humans go into jungles, they leave their trash there, they leave their stuff there, everything there. Should we have primates that will increase their parasites in time?
Oh yeah. One of the major reservoirs of Zika in Brazil right now is spider monkeys, and human beings gave it to them. And one of the things that I was in Brazil, I was with Walter. I was in Brazil on a Ciências Sem Fronteiras fellowship in 2014, 15, and 16. 2014, the Zika business began to blow up, and my colleague there, Walter Bieger, went to the Brazilian government and said, "You have got to start monitoring the non-human primates because Zika is going to get into them, and then you'll never get rid of Zika." And they said, "No, it's not. It's not going to get into. These things don't host switch. They have to wait till there's a genetic mutation, and it's not going to happen." And now, Zika's in the spider monkeys. There are the strain of yellow fever from the most recent outbreak in Minas Gerais state in Brazil. That's the strain of yellow fever that's showing up in the howler monkeys in Brazil now. So there's an enormous amount of things moving in both directions. And one of the things that we know empirically is that if you have a pathogen that's causing disease in one species of host, you can be certain that there's another species of host that is the reservoir of that pathogen. And we don't know about it because that host is not diseased, so we don't pay any attention to it. That's where finding them before they find us comes from. So part of the protocol is that we need to be really focusing on the interfaces between green spaces and urban spaces and agricultural and wildlands, because that's where, I mean, I guarantee you that there are a whole lot of pathogens that are being transmitted between wild boar and domestic pigs in this country. And and there are other things like borreliosis, Lyme disease. That's we now know there are 18 different species of Borrelia in Hungary alone, and each one has a different reservoir, and oftentimes the reservoir is something we never thought about. So you're right, and one of the things that's interesting in the history of parasitology, we have an enormous number of studies of parasites that get transmitted to really funny hosts in zoos. And we've always just dismissed those. Oh, you can't trust that. Of course, everybody's stressed and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is all these zoo records give us an indication of who could be susceptible if the conditions were right.
Sasha.
Excuse me, but if there is a host species that has specimens do not have disease, is this not an example of coevolution?
No. It's an example of two species that are capable of living together. Okay, I mean, it's coevolution if you want to say that the entire biosphere is co-evolved. And I mean, that's kind of the view that James Lovelock likes to promote, the Gaia hypothesis and everything, where everybody's just getting along together really fine. But one of the things that's interesting, Roy Anderson and Robert May published a series of models in the late 1970s. So more than 40 years ago, they published a series of mathematical models that showed that there is no necessary connection between pathogenicity and the persistence of a pathogen in a host. So just because you're not causing disease doesn't mean you're going to be able to survive in that host for a long time. Even if you're highly pathogenic, you're not necessarily going to go extinct from that host. The issue of whether disease is being caused or not is an emergent property of something else. So for example, if we, for example, with Ebola, right? The impression is that if you get Ebola, you die. And in some cases that's true, but in some cases it's only 20% of the people who get Ebola die. And that's because we quote unquote don't understand that because we haven't been studying the population genetics of Ebola. And it turns out that the different reservoir hosts of Ebola in different parts of Africa have different strains of Ebola. And those strains have differential degrees of impact on hosts like humans, where it can't persist. Ebola can't persist in humans for more than 6 weeks. But it could be that you could be having coevolutionary dynamics and pathogenicity. It could be that you could be having coevolutionary dynamics and nothing. But neither one of those is necessary. And that's one of the reasons why we have all these models about very tight coevolution, and almost, to speak to this gentleman's point, almost no published cases in which it's been documented experimentally. I mean, this is one of the weird things about the coevolutionary arms race. Everybody just says it's happening, but we actually have almost no experimental studies that document it.